he and I did a Captain Marvel and She-Hulk chapter together, and I was so impressed with the level of energy and expressiveness that he brought to the book. And right after I had turned in my outline to Mad Cave for approval for Speed Racer, I actually ran into him at New York Comic Con, and we were talking. And I said, "David, what are you up to right now?" And he was like, "Actually, my schedule is starting to open up." And I was like, "We should talk about Speed Racer." And so, I mentioned to Chaz, I was like, "Here's kind of some names of some people that I think would be a really good fit." I think David Tinto is kind of at the top of the list. And thankfully, Chaz and Tatsunoko and Mad Cave agreed. And so once we had kind of David locked in, we were able to figure out like who else we could pair with them, like Rex Locus on colors. I was really a fan of what Rex was doing in colors over on the Aquaman book
Mm.
with my friend Jeremy Adams. And so I was like, oh, hey, like, would he be available and interested to do something like this? And I love the way that Rex and David's art kind of play off each other. And then Buddy and I, we've known each other from the convention scene.
Mm.
And Buddy really wanted to get something off the ground with me at some point, and I know he had worked a lot with Chaz, and so it was one of those things. Uh, Chaz kind of came up to me and said, like, "We're going to put Buddy on the book," and I was a real fan of what he had done in Gotcha Man with the lettering.
Mm.
So it really the team kind of really clicked together in a nice way. But it's funny you talk about the free comic book day issue because actually that was the issue that sort of kind of came in at the very last minute. I when I
Yeah.
was first approached for the book, I was told we're going to do 15 issues, and then as I was sort of developing everything, Chaz came to me and said, "Actually, we might be doing a free comic book day issue, and if we are doing that, that means we're going to have to start like now, now, now." And I think like a week or so later, Chaz said, "We're going to do it." And it became really a really interesting challenge for me because, on the one hand, I wanted to do a self contained story. I don't like the free comic book day issues that are just a couple of teaser pages. And at the same time, I didn't want to do an issue that if you missed it, then you wouldn't understand issue one. And so it
Mm.
was really this interesting challenge of how do I write kind of two different issue ones in a way
Mhm.
one that it works whether or not you read it. And so that was kind of like the teaser of it all, sort of this idea of sort of seeing the world of Palm City and kind of getting to see Speed as sort of this force rather than sort of waiting a little while before we dig into the character and getting to introduce all the supporting cast. That was sort of my way of circling the square, and I think kind of a little bit of a love letter to my newspaper days. I think every city kind of has its own personality and its own points of pride and the things that it does well and its obsessions and its pastimes. And so the idea of Palm City sort of being this ultimate racing town, the place where sort of Formula X was born, but there's also this burgeoning street racer scene. And that
Mm.
really was kind of my way in, this idea that like Speed, he hasn't turned a pro yet, but he's sort of come from this unlikely beginnings of these back alley races and just kind of shows like he's got this all this talent, but he still has so much more to learn. And it's that kind of interesting mesh that makes Speed, I think, such an interesting character, is because he's got so much talent, but he still has so much room to grow.
Yeah. Hence what
That's
I
so
was
cool.
saying. The Fast and the Furious, man. I
Yeah.
was like, it. Now that book during Free Comic Book Day, because now again, book hasn't been released yet.
Yeah.
We are Alternate Universe LLC, one of our sponsors. That book was constantly, we had to replenish the stack because it was moving
That's what I like to hear.
more.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was moving more than the Marvel, moving more than the DC stuff. I mean, it was here. Here you go. Here you go. Here you go. I was super happy, and it was just now. Sophia, she was streaming in because she wasn't at the store with me
Yeah.
that day, and it was so many people were coming over. Yep, Speed Racer, Speed Racer,
Hmm.
and I was like, wow, this book is going to be hot when it comes out, and sure enough, it is. Now, you said you went back and you did a lot of, you did your homework. And this is what
Yeah.
Sophia and I always say all the time. Do your homework. Don't say you're a big fan unless you do your homework.
Yeah.
Was it just the original series that you
Yes.
watched, or did you watch that crappy reboot? Because that crappy reboot was awful.
It's one of those things. The Speed Racer rights are a little bit complicated, and so really, it was very much I was told from the beginning. You can draw from the original anime and you can draw from the original manga, but that's sort of what Tatsunoko has the rights to. So Things
Okay.
like the reboot cartoon, things like the Speed Racer movie. Those things are off
Boo.
limits to me. Which is why you're never going
Good.
to see like Cannonball Taylor in my book, even though I think that name rules. You know, I so it was one of those things like I had kind of that core to go by, and that core was already very substantial. I think it's like 52 episodes, and they're 22 minutes each.
Mhm.
And for me, when I say I watch all of them, it's not just sort of me just sitting there on the couch. It's literally I'm basically writing my own not transcription, but I'm writing my own summary bullet point for every single episode, which means that like a 22-minute episode in real time is probably something like an hour and a half
Mhm.
when you have to sort of pause and rewind and say, did I hear that thing properly? And so
Dude, I did that with the theme song when I was a kid. Come
yeah,
on.
it was certainly, and I think that's the hardest thing about a book like that. Or I did the same thing on Space Ghost. Is if you don't know the mythology, you got to learn the mythology, and that becomes there's no shortcutting that. That's really like you have to just like it's a little bit it's very time consuming work, and it's work that sort of like kind of affects my brain in maybe a less than great way, because you just have to sit there and listen. You can't even like jump to conclusions. You can sort of just sit there and kind of let it percolate a little bit. So yeah, it just takes time, and when you're under deadlines, time is not something you always have. So thankfully we were able to kind of like get it all together. But yeah, and I think it wound up working for the book. I think that's the reason why I do it, even though it's kind of a pain in the butt sometimes. Is that like I would much rather do my homework now than have a diehard fan, be upset and come at me and saying, well, what about this character that I would expect to be in a book like this? So I feel like for Speed Racer, I think we've covered just about all the bases. I think there was only one villain that I'm aware of that I couldn't quite fit in with the runway. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, I feel like we're really going to hit like all the major stuff as we sort of see Speed's trials and tribulations on the way to the Formula X championship.
That's
That's
awesome.
awesome. Sophia, we just had a comment from Marcus.
Yes.
Marcus is from So Wizard Podcast. Kid,
Yeah,
Marcus wants to know, was there a challenge to bring in some elements from classic anime like Chim Chim?
boy, that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, it was a welcome challenge. Of course, there were a few elements to it. I mean, to answer your direct question, Chim Chim was sort of a we went back up and forth on Chim Chim quite a bit. And I think it comes down to um, when you write the treatment of an outline or a pitch for a book like this, you only sort of have an approximation of what the tone's going to be, because the tone is
Mhm.
really determined by your artist, and you don't know who your artist is going to be most of the time. So you're kind of just guessing a little bit, and knowing that the art will kind of make that choice for you in a lot of ways. And so I'd written a lot of monkey characters. I've written Blip in the pages of Space Ghost. I was already committed to writing Captain Planet, which has Mati and his monkey. I'd written my Wizard of Oz book, The OZ, which has a bunch of winged
Mhm.
monkeys. And I was like, oh, is having the monkey going to be too much of, is it going to take people out of it? And we went back and forth with Tatsunoko many times over like, are we going to have him in there? Are we not going to have him in there? And kind of at the 11th hour, as we were working on the Free Comic Book Day issue, rather than having Spritel's channel on YouTube just being kind of monkey branded, we're like, you know what? Let's give him the monkey. Let's sort of have it be like one of those helper monkeys. And then if we ever get the chance to tell that story, either in the main book or in Tales from the Road, we can sort of figure out like this idea of like, how did Spritel win Chim Chim? And I feel like it's some crazy night that like Spritel had where he won Chim Chim in a bet and came home, and they're like, why do you have a monkey? But it's also very Spritel coded. Um, but there are definitely other things like, figuring out the gadgets of the Mach 5 was kind of like the big thing for me to wrap my brain around, because you want those gadgets. I don't think it's Speed Racer without them. But at the
Mhm.
same time, you have to circle the square of, how do you have a car with all those gadgets and it not seem like Speed is boxing with weighted gloves? How do you make it seem fair? How do you keep Speed as the underdog? um, you know uh, as we were coming up with it, Mark Russell was the one who kind of coined the term Formula X. And I was like, okay, that's a cool thing, and that gives me this room to say, all the cars have certain characteristics to them. They all have the auto jacks. They all have the belt tires. You know, whereas they each have their own signature weapon. And so that way you can kind of say Speed has the buzzsaw, whereas you know somebody like Racer X has like a grappling cable, or Snake Oiler, for example, had like acidic venom. And I'm very excited. You know, the weapon that Kim Jugger, the Black Jaguar, has in our issue 4 and 5 coming up. That's really
Mhm.
neat looking. So yeah, I that was I think the biggest challenge for all that. I think everything else, you know, the bones of Speed Racer, I think, are very timeless. I don't think there's anything broken. There's nothing that needs to be fixed. It's really kind of pop culture archaeology. It's just figuring out kind of like the bones of it, and then kind of just giving them a light dusting to make them kind of sparkle like new. But I think there's something, you know, Speed's dynamic with Racer X, I think, is a potent kind of thing for this book. And I loved in the original episodes that Pops doesn't want Speed to race, you know,
Yeah.
and it sort of it alludes to this kind of family trauma of Rex leaving. And we tried to kind of like elevate that a little bit to just Rex being presumed dead. I figured a lot of people would have assumed, you know, that's sort of a bit of the lore that's mutated since the Speed Racer movie. And so, you know, that idea of that family trauma kind of being like the inciting event, and that's the thing that sort of left Speed and Pops and Spritel and Ma Racer all in their kind of respective corners. Um, that I think was something that was really neat, and that I think becomes that's the anchor for all this. You know, you could have all the spectacle in the world, but if you don't care about these characters, if you don't give them something emotional to fight for, then it's all kind of nonsense. So, you know, I think Speed Racer in particular is a very human story. There's no superpowers to lean on. There's no sort of world shaking stakes. It's all very personal. It's all very human.
Still,
And yeah, you know, and just I think that that vulnerability for a
yeah,
character like Speed and really the
yeah, because you
entire
can
cast.
relate to them.
Yeah, you know, it's a different challenge than most things I've written because I've been writing superheroes now kind of nonstop for the last few years. But I think it's good training. It's a muscle group that I think when you forget how to use it, it makes all your stories worse because of this, you know, like I'm not trying to write to preach to the choir. I want converts. I want to write this book. If you've never read a comic before, I can sell
Hmm.
this to you at my convention table. You know, I always say that I write my books for an audience of one, and that's my wife. She's not a diehard comics fan, but she reads all my scripts before I send them. And if she feels something, then I know that I've made this thing accessible enough and it's not bogged down by just like spectacle upon spectacle. And Speed Racer, I think, is the book that really represents that the most for me right now.
Well,
That's awesome.
the whole story of the Racer family is family driven from
Yeah,
going back to the original source material,
yeah,
even through the crappy reboot cartoon and the movie. It was all very family driven because it is a family.
yeah,
Promise me one thing: you're going to keep the Mach 6 out of the story.
yeah. There's
Good.
you'll the Mach 5 I think is a core bit
Mm,
of iconography for all this. But you know, it's one of those things that like you'll see like the idea of design and skill sort of you know being two sides of the same coin. That's something that's going to pop up as a theme throughout the whole series. You know, this
awesome.
idea of like, you know, I guess I can give you guys like a little tease. We haven't solicited it yet, but issues 6 and 7 are going to be our big GRX engine two-parter. And
Ooh.
this idea, I pitched it as sort of like Creed 2, the idea of sort of the sins of the fathers coming to haunt the sons. And so it's Speed versus the son of Dr. Ben Cranham, the creator of the GRX engine, Carl Cranham. And Carl sort of blames Pops Racer for his father's disgrace and death. And he's going to get revenge on the Racer family by any means necessary using sort of this dangerous, unstable engine known as the GRX. And you know that is going to become like I think a big thing for Speed is that like he's going to finally face a problem that he can't just muscle his way out of, and so he's going to have to actually use his head. And so like things like that like I think are really fun. And so it's one of those things that I think the Mach 5, I want it to stay as consistent as I can. So
Uh-huh.
that way, like, people have, like, a good foundation to kinda lean on, and also that way, like, we can't just bail